Göttingen, May 1945. Through broken window frames, spring light falls across ransacked drawers and glass-dusted files at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Fluid Dynamics, where a young Boeing aerodynamicist, George S. Scherer, granted 48 hours by U.S. Army intelligence before the place is sealed, wipes soot from a slim volume, Rome, 1935, the Volta Congress, and finds in the Gothic type a quiet revelation, Adolf Busemann's elegant unbuilt geometry that angles a wing 35 degrees backward, softens the shock, and slips the noose of the sound barrier. Strange, he thinks, that no one built it, even as Allied pilots in 1944 learned the hard way that air could turn to a wall buffet, locked controls, noses driving down in the transonic twilight where tunnels lied and math ran thin. He scrawls a field note, sweep the wings 35 degrees, and an MP carries it to right field, then to Seattle, where within months drafting tables are cleared. A straight-wing jet bomber is halted, and a redesign begins that will birth the B-47, and through it every swept-wing jetliner you've ever boarded, the 707, the DC-8, the lineage that carries 4 billion passengers annually. But the hinge was forged in a scramble for paper and mines as much as in equations, in a Germany where the Luftwaffe had flown jets, but not far enough, where high-speed wind tunnels in Braunschweig, Göttingen, and Peenemünde had been humming for years behind sealed doors, and where, as the Reich collapsed, British T-Force, America's Operation Lusty, and Soviet trophy brigades fanned out to seize laboratories before the files could burn. In that narrow window, Scherer walks a gutted AVA Göttingen, cracked observation glass, charred edges on reports, staff fled or detained authorized to read, photograph, and report, not to loot, and he finds not a pilfered prototype, but an orphaned idea, openly published and then forgotten, and in Braunschweig, wartime tunnel data that proves moderate sweep in hard numbers. The cable lands in Seattle like a detonator, and Ed Wells and Maynard Pennell roll new models into NACA's tunnels at Langley and Ames, where oil flows clear over swept planforms that stall and snarl on straight wings. And with vindication comes a cascade. Pitch up when tips stall first, Dutch roll that makes the airframe wallow, spanwise flow starving the tips, torsion in a skewed wing box, thin wings with too little fuel and no room for gear. The answers, wing fences and leading-edge slats, a first-of-its-kind yaw damper, rows of tiny vortex generators to energize the boundary layer, heavier diagonal structure, and a radical bicycle landing gear with engines in clean pods under the wing are penciled, argued, and riveted into a new machine, Model 462, as the straight-wing 450 dies. On December 17, 1947, at Moses Lake, the XB-47 tilts nose-high on that odd bicycle gear and leaps forward, outrunning its P-80 chase, and then, as every new airplane must, it teaches, yaw-roll coupling tamed by an automatic damper, brake fires met with a ribbon drag chute borrowed from German practice, wing flutter killed with stiffer pylons, pitch up disciplined by vortex generators, fin buffet eased by dorsal fillets, each fix a scar and a step forward, until by 1949 it is climbing past 40,000 feet and cruising above 600 miles an hour, the bomber that rewrites doctrine so completely that Curtis LeMay orders thousands and Boeing scales the planform into the B-52, sending 8-podded engines and 35 degrees of sweep into the nuclear age. And yet the story is never only American. At Langley, the self-taught R.T. Jones had sketched sweep independently before the war ended. British teams hauled cabinets west, Soviet brigades crated whole tunnels east, and set German engineers to work so 3 cousins rise almost together in 1947, the B-47, the F-86 Sabre, and the MiG-15, convergent outcomes of a scattered library meeting over Korea where the geometry first chalked on a Rome blackboard is tested in contrails. After the bomber comes the passenger promise, Boeing's Dash 80 turned 707, Douglas's DC-8, the Soviet T-104, all swept wings and podded engines, the grammar of modern flight until that ruin-born angle carries the world. And behind the steel and speed, an unsettled ledger remains, because Busseman had published in 1935 and emigrated in 1947, yet his name seldom appears on patents, and in Schirer's notebook a penciled question lingers: whose idea becomes this? While occupation law makes seizure legal, but the line between wartime salvage and intellectual plunder still haunts the credit, the patents, and the stories we tell. From a soot-smudged book in a shattered lab to the hush of a yaw damper you never feel at 35,000 feet, the arc is continuous. Busseman's angle, Jones's equations, Schirer's letter, Boeing's risk, NACA's tunnels, and the unforgiving lessons of flight test and the world's journeys ride on the geometry found in the ruins as the Reich fell. But the promise the Stratojet delivered came with a reckoning measured not just in knots and altitude, but in human margins, the way a new doctrine strains muscle and machine until it finds what breaks. On SAC ramps in the early 50s, the B-47's narrow bicycle gear demanded runways long and smooth as glass. Crosswinds that a straight-wing bomber would shrug off now became dice rolls, and long missions at 40,000 feet in a cockpit more fighter than fortress pressed crews into a kind of high, humming exhaustion. Fast, yes, but cramped, no relief. The yaw damper whispering away a death wallow, while fuel state and icing and fatigue braided into risk, and the accident sheets told their own hard truths. Almost 400 aircraft lost in mishaps before the type stood down, a price paid for speed in an era that prized it. And yet strategic arithmetic held. The Stratojet made interception a fantasy, pushed the fight up and out, normalized aerial refueling as the scaffold of global reach, and turned the bomber from gun-bristled citadel into a dart that lived on thin margins and velocity. And as SAC learned to live with the airplane's demands, the camera cuts forward to a larger shadow taking shape in the same drafting rooms, a shape that kept the 35-degree sweep, doubled the engines in pods, and kept the bicycle gear under a broader, thinner wing, the B-52, which in April 1952 left the runway with a casual authority the B-47 had earned the hard way, a cathedral of airflow and structure that would, improbably, outlive the century, proof that a planform born in ruins could be scaled and refined until it was less an experiment than a nation's long arm. But the meaning of that geometry was never only martial. The same lines were already being softened for passengers, windows cut into a fuselage wide enough to seat 6 abreast, the sweep reduced a hair to ease the low-speed bite. Engines in pods hung where mechanics could reach them. The pilot's workload lightened with augmented controls. And in July 1954, a prototype, Boeing's Dash 80, rose in turn toward a horizon made shorter by every knot. And by 1955, Pan Am put down a bet that would erase an oceans-old arithmetic. And in 1958, the 707 slashed New York to London to 7 hours, while Douglas launched the DC-8 in its wake. The Soviets rolled out the T-104, and by 1960, the gondola engine, swept-wing grammar was the only language transatlantic airlines spoke. It is one thing to say that 4 billion passengers now ride inside Busseman's angle. Quite another to feel how that abstraction resolves into a morning at Idlewild turned JFK, spring light on an aluminum wing that bends under fuel and lift as you settle into a seat, the yaw damper smoothing a motion you never feel because the arguments in Seattle ended with a brave yes, because the tunnels at Langley and Ames spat black and white oil flow photographs that said the air would obey a different order if you angled the leading edge, because an idea that sat on a shelf in Göttingen survived the war that swallowed its author's country. And still the story refuses to end where the machines succeed, because credit is a thread that frays across languages and borders. Robert T. Jones, the self-taught geometer at NACA, wrote in January 1945 what he would later concede had been said first. I had the idea independently, but Busseman had it first. Did Xavier's photographs accelerate our program? Absolutely. Did we need them to arrive at sweep? Probably not. But we'd have been a year slower, and in 1945, a year mattered. And in Moscow, where the crated wind tunnels from Brunswick were reassembled at Sagi, Artem Mikoyan's bureau read the same German plots on drag divergence and spanwise flow and built a 37-degree wing that climbed into the same thin air as North American's 35-degree Sabre, converging not by theft but by shared inheritance. so that when the contrails were raided over the Yalu in 1950, cousins met at the edge of the sound barrier and discovered that tunnel curves redraw themselves when the sky has guns. Even the paperwork bears witness to the shape of truth, fiat stamps on seized reports, von Karman's Toward New Horizons volumes laid before generals in December 1945, recommending, quite calmly, a future already latent in those choked German tunnels. And in Seattle, the George S. Scherer papers boxed and labeled Box 4, Folders 12 to 15, a handwriting that leans forward across time, while in Rome, the Atti del Quinto Convegno Volta sits quietly on a library shelf, 1935 bound in tan cloth, a title in Italian, a German paper inside, with a title that still feels like a dare, Aerodynamico Auftrieb ante Überschallgeschwindigkeit. In this film, the camera lingers on the documents not as props but as living artifacts of a chain of custody, photographs of Schlieren patterns, NACA Report 863, a translation of Buseman published as NACA TM 1284 long after the fact, as if the United States needed to make the German words American before the history could feel settled. And a narrator's voice, careful in the way old pilots are careful, reminds you that memory can blur machines like a poor caption, that the Messerschmitt ME-262 carried only a modest sweep of 18 degrees, and the Arado R-234 flew with a straight wing, that the raw bare-metal XB-47 of 1947 is not the slick, filleted B-47E of 1955, that the dorsal fin grew out of Buffett like a callus, that getting the names right is not pedantry but respect, because mislabeling is how myths slip their leash. The math, too, sits where the camera can see it, no more mystical than a cosine, the perpendicular component of airflow reduced by the angle, cosine 35 degrees giving you 0.819, which is to say that at Mach 0.86, the wing, turned back, sees only about Mach 0.7 across its leading edge, a number simple enough to be written on a field letter and consequential enough to move an industry, and the data from Ames and Langley double and redouble the calculus, turning a hunch into a test report into an airplane. Meanwhile, the men and women who closed those loops flicker across the screen. Maynard Pennell hoarse with slides and numbers in a smoky conference room, Bob Withington worrying weight as if it were a personal affront, Ed Wells with a slide rule like a javel, pressurizing a decision that could lose a contract or change a doctrine. And there is something implacably American and unavoidably global in how it played out, because while Seattle argued and built, British officers, with the matter-of-fact predation of T-Force, swept German sites in April 1945, boxing documents before the Russians come, and Soviet trophy brigades in the east took entire tunnels in teams. And in 1947, Adolf Buseman himself, the quiet man whose line on the blackboard bent the century's airflow, stepped onto an American ship under paperclip and went to work at Langley without litigation or resentment, later saying in an old man's steady cadence, "Science is not owned. An idea I publish becomes part of the common fund. If I keep it secret and you find it in war, that is your victory. If I publish it and you build it, that is science." And yet, even as he said it, the patents bore other names, and the money flowed elsewhere, and the school books told a simpler story, as they often do. The camera returns for a last lingering survey to the test flight tarmac at Moses Lake in the high summer of 1949. Brake dust and sage in the air, a crew chief swearing softly at a cracked vortex generator no bigger than a thumbnail, a pilot insisting on 6 spares and getting 3. And somewhere between those numbers, 6 ass 3 in hand, lies the essence of what made the B-47 work, the willingness to fly anyway, to learn in public, to write service bulletins as if flight test were a printing press. And then we are back above the continent at 35,000 feet, where the yaw damper murmurs its invisible lullaby, and the sweep does its trigonometric trick, and the passengers order coffee, unaware that this piece in motion is braided to a story of looted archives and lawful seizures, and parallel reinventions, of a geometry that crossed borders under duress and then under choice, of engineers who argued with numbers and won, of a question that will not entirely quiet, whose idea becomes this, and of the way victory writes not only tonibis but textbooks until the next historian opens a box in a quiet archive and reads the penciled line that makes the past feel newly dangerous. And because a story like this resists ending, the film's voice leans forward one last time, not to summarize but to point down 2 corridors this tale has opened. The first to the ships and trains that carried German scientists west under new names and clearances, to the gray offices where paperclip turned enemies into colleagues and made moral compromises feel like policy, to the American laboratories that absorbed men like Buseman and von Braun and the quieter rank and file, and to the engineers who had to decide whether history owed them gratitude or apology, and to the second, to the cold, thin air over Korea, where the swept-wing cousins met and tested what tunnel plots could not predict, where a degree of angle and a half-second of hesitation drew the border between home and the ground. Threads of the same fabric, stitched out of the same papers and equations and choices that began in a sunlit, glass-dusted office in Göttingen in May 1945. The camera fades not to black, but to the silvery sheen of a wing flexing under load, and to the steady, unshowy truth that the world we move through every day rests on a line someone once drew on a blackboard, that a letter written in a ruined institute can cross an ocean, and, if the right people believe it, bend the century. And because those corridors lead somewhere, we follow them, to the ports where gray crates marked with German script are craned into American holds, to the rail sidings where men with new papers in careful English step down into a country that has decided, practically, to make its former adversaries into colleagues, to a quiet office at Langley in 1947 where Adolf Buseman hangs his hat on a wooden peg and begins again with shock waves and thin wings, while the older masters, Prandtl and Betz, stay behind in a ruined institute whose windows he once dusted, and in Dayton at Wright Field, whole rooms smell of mimeograph ink as translators in shirt sleeves turn Gothic type into American memos, names like Multop and Gothard crossing the page, and upstairs engineers thumb through photographs of Schlieren ghosts and draw their own conclusions, because however the papers travel, ideas move at their own speed. Then the camera lifts to the Yalu River in winter, where contrails etch white bowstrings across a hard blue sky, and the swept-wing cousins meet for the first time. North American's F-86 Sabre with its 35-degree planform, born of Naka geometry and captured reports, Mikoyan's Meg-15 with 37 degrees of sweep, fences on the wing, and a British-sired turbine at its heart, the Rolls-Royce Nain, licensed and made Russian as the Klimov VK-1, so that in Mig Alley, over a river whose bridges keep a war supplied, two lineages of the same idea, close to gun range, and discover how numbers become survival, jet wash and cannon shells, and the sudden buffet of a wing close to its stall, reminding pilots that tunnels and test cards are only prologue. Back home, the B-47 speed becomes a posture. SAC's reflex deployments, moving stratojets by rotation into Moroccan and Spanish airfields pushed long and smooth for bicycle gear, crews sleeping on quick reaction alert under wings that no longer bristled with guns but carried the new arithmetic, genies, and gravity weapons in a doctrine that believed altitude and velocity outrun interception. And on winter mornings, ground crews fit Jado bottles to a machine that sometimes needs a push off the concrete. 8 throaty rockets lancing smoke as the jet lifts on a short runway, and when it returns, the ribbon drag chute flowers behind the tail in a ritual learned from German test films, white silk taming speed until the drums in the brakes stop glowing. In living rooms across America, the jet age slips from newsreels into habit as a prototype with Boeing's house number 367-80 loops high over Lake Washington one August afternoon in 1955, rolling in a perfect level arc that leaves picnic crowds holding their breath and airline men calculating market share. And with Pan Am's penstroke, the 707 becomes the new baseline. Douglas answers with the DC-8, and by the end of the decade, airport terminals are galleries of swept wings, Caravel's modest angle and rear engines, Comet rebuilt from its early failings, American forms and European variants, all speaking the same language that began in a Rome lecture hall. The technology deepens, yaw dampers, tentative at Moses Lake, become standard in every airliner you board. Podded engines reduce bending loads at the wing root and let mechanics unbolt a turbine in an afternoon. Supercritical airfoils and winglets arrive in the next generation, like refinements to a familiar script, but the geometry underneath stays the same, the leading edge still pulled back against the air as if to dodge a blow. And even as the commercial story smooths, the military arc reveals its own blunt coda. In 1957, the first SA-2 missiles rise on Soviet rails, and by the early 60s, the high-altitude sanctuary the B-47 opened is closing. The Stratojet too slim and springy for the violent low-level turbulence that the B-52 will learn to ride. Its career shortened by the very progress it forced. Its accident tally a ledger of what was learned in speed. Behind the machines, the paperwork continues to insist on precision, and the film honors it with its own discipline, freezing frames to stamp dates and places where myth could creep in. Göttingen in spring 1945, not autumn. The T-Force War Office files from Q in April, not June. The XB-47 bare metal at Moses Lake, not a later E model at MacDill. And on a table, the sources lie open because the story's credibility lives in their margins. Von Karman's Toward New Horizons, the T-Force War Office files from Q, the Boeing folders with Scherer's field letters, the Naka memos where R.T. Jones writes down a geometry that matches a German drawing he hadn't yet read, the Naka translation of Busemann's 1935 paper printed in 1951 as if to place the idea, finally, into the official American tongue. And if you listen closely, you can hear the ethics rustle beneath the paper, that pencil-smudged question in Scherer's notebook, whose idea becomes this, asking for an answer that is not a verdict, but a census, because the record shows what happened in law and in practice. Occupation rules made seizure a policy. T-Force and Lusty and the Soviet trophy brigades all ran their crews along the same lines. The Americans brought Busemann over with a contract rather than handcuffs. He never sued, and later dismissed the word theft. And yet the patents left him out, and in school books, the airplanes appeared as pure products of national genius, when they were in fact mosaics, German tesserae fitted into American and Soviet designs, and the value added in tunnels, in test flights, and persistence no more erases the origin than an ocean erases a ship's registry. The camera returns to the lab one more time, to the oil flow photographs at Ames, where white paint rivers show how a swept wing delays the shock until the numbers let you fly level at 0.90, to the chalkboard where Jones writes cosine 35 degrees as casually as a shopping list and turns a trigonometric aside into a policy that moves steel, to a machinist's hands on a pylon brace drilled just a little thicker after a flutter scare puts a buzz in a pilot's teeth, to a crew chief's palms black with brake dust while a ribbon chute dries in the sun, to a young engineer in 1962 at Boeing learning he can bring an airplane back from a slow, sickening Dutch roll because the yaw damper fails safe now, triple redundant after the early lessons, and to the passengers who never feel any of it, as the cabin sighs in a pressurization cycle, and the wing bends like a bow under lift, and the narrator's voice does not soften as it reminds you that this invisibility, this absence of drama, is the greatest compliment a hard history can pay itself. In the end, the story lands where it must, not in triumphalism, but in a kind of precise gratitude, because a soot-streaked book in a broken window changed the speed at which nations move, because a letter from a ruined institute redrew a bomber, because the bomber's plan form taught a company how to build a world's worth of airliners, because a Roman lecture in 1935 grew legs in 1945 and became, by 1958, the everyday wing over oceans, because the people who did the work argued and doubted and risked, and when they got it wrong, went back to the tunnel and flew again, and because the ghosts in the footnotes still deserve their names called as the credits roll. Busemann with his arrow on a blackboard, Jones with his geometry in a memo, Scherer with his Leica and his urgency, Wells and Pennell with their slide rules and their nerve, the unnamed translators and archivists who kept the trail unbroken, the pilots and crew chiefs whose palms and nerves made the abstractions real. The century bent where that wing bent, and the line from Göttingen to the gate at your local airport is straighter than you think, written in angles and carried across borders by a kind of pragmatic faith that if the air behaves, the rest will follow. In museums and on flight lines, the evidence sits in quiet light. An XB-47 prototype in bare metal under a high desert sun, a dorsal fillet casting a curved shadow on concrete, children walking beneath a wing that once learned to stop shaking at Mach .88, while across an ocean, in a university archive, a clerk lays out the Atti del Convegno Volta and turns to the pages where a young man's diagrams first bent the air. The film's title asks, as titles do, a question sharpened for the marquee. Did Boeing steal the swept wing? And the narration, steady and unhurried now, answers as the camera lingers on paper and metal. No, not theft, not a secret spirited away in the night, but a convergence, a chain of custody in daylight, where occupation orders and open publications and independent reinvention braided into a single line of flight, a record that is stronger and more complicated than a simple heist. On screen, the lower thirds flicker like honest footnotes, the cosine of 35 degrees laid over a Schlieren photo, the drag divergence curve plotted beside a shot of a B-47 at cruise, the date stamped under each image to anchor memory to place, and the curve of global passengers since 1960 climbs like a takeoff profile, millions, then billions, because the geometry proved itself not just in Bombays, but in aisles and galley carts and the hush of a cabin settling as the wing takes load. And in the decades that follow, the language refines but does not change. Supercritical airfoils fatten the top of the curve near Mach 1. Winglets curl in like parentheses at the tips to harvest wasted vortices. Composites letting a wing flex farther without gaining weight. Computer models resolving shock and boundary layer in colors Boosman never had. But always the sweep remains, an old note that no one feels the need to revise. The moral weight of it lingers without melodrama in a final pass through faces and hands. Boosman older now, in an American office, eyes on a wind tunnel print. Jones at a chalkboard with his neat, unshowy script. Scherer in a photograph with a Leica on its strap, a man who read quickly because he only had 48 hours. Ed Wells in shirt sleeves, slide rule tucked in a pocket like a holstered argument. A British lorry with T-Force chalked on its bumper, a Soviet flat car groaning under a tunnel section, a NACA technician tapping a rate gyro case before bolting it into a yaw damper rack, a Moses Lake crew chief wiping brake dust from his palms, a Pan Am stewardess closing an overhead bin on the first morning the Atlantic became a day's work, each a custodian of a piece of the same arc. And then, with the camera pressed once more against glass in the Göttingen ruins, spring light falling on soot and paper, the narrative allows itself a closing truth, spoken as if into that dust, that innovation is rarely a flag planted by a single hand, but a relay, that the war which tried to stop a century also accelerated it in perverse ways, that the spoils we took were also gifts we finally learned to name, and that the clean line of a swept wing carries both the grace of mathematics and the shadows of how we acquired it. The last image holds on a 1935 sketch of an arrowhead planform, the pencil strokes faint and human, and then dissolves into a modern computational flow field dancing in false color over a 787's wing, the same angle hiding in a different skin, the same promise honored in a different sky, and the voice that has carried us from a shattered window to a pressurized cabin lets the silence sit a moment before it fades, leaving only the shape of the air and the certainty that somewhere a letter is being written that will, once again, bend the world. And in the quiet after that fade, the film lingers, where history lives when the headlines go cold. In reading rooms, in hangars, and memory's margins, a desk lamp pools light over a War Office folder at Q, whose typed spine still carries its numbers, a Keyforce report enumerating tunnel films, and swept-wing plots boxed at Göttingen and Braunschweig prior to Soviet arrival. The paper burnished where a clerk's thumb turned it 70 years ago. A freight platform in Bremen under sleet where crates thump into a U.S. Army truck, black stencils bleeding through canvas. And in the same winter, a hangar at Wright Field, where Watson's whizzers wheel a captured Me-262 into the light and strip it to lessons, not because its wing will be copied, it will not, but because its speed makes straight wings feel suddenly antique. In California, North American's design office turns from drawings of a straight-wing XP-86 to a fighter with 35 degrees of sweep, Ede Schmude and his team poring over NACA memos and German curbs, while R.T. Jones, precise and shy, explains the geometry again at a chalkboard, as if its simplicity might finally be the thing that persuades. In Moscow's gray noon, a tunnel panel from Braunschweig slides into its slot at Saji with a clank. Engineers in heavy coats lift German reports and begin to mark them in Cyrillic. And across town, Artem Mikoyan's bureau sketches a wing that will climb like a thrown knife. In Korea, the sky is a lens of ice and light, and contrails curl into spirals where Sabre and MiG test competing virtues. The MiGs climb in first bite of altitude, the Sabres roll and dive, slats snapping open on early models to hold a wing at the edge. Pilots learning that the numbers in the margins are not doctrine, but warning labels, that at 600 miles an hour, a degree of sweep, a slat schedule, a pylon brace can make the fatal difference. Back in the States, Strategic Air Command folds the B-47 into a new posture so complete it changes geography. Reflex deployments circling stratojets through Sidi Suleiman and Ben Guerer, Breeze Norton and Upper Hayford. Linoleum-floored ready rooms smelling of coffee and jet fuel, where crews sleep in flight suits under wings that demand smooth concrete and long approaches, the bicycle gear braced for crosswinds that test nerves as hard as needles on a scope do. And when the runway shortens, they strap on JATO bottles in pairs along the fuselage and thump into the sky under 8 brief, brutal pillars of flame. The pace of learning is unsentimental. At Moses Lake, a test card that used to read Investigate Dutch Roll now reads Verify yaw damper channels A, B, C. A ribbon chute spreads behind a tail and comes home singed at the edges. A pylon doubler plate carries a new part number, and the flutter vanishes from a test pilot's fingertips, and the dorsal fin fillet, born of buffet, becomes a signature curve that schoolchildren trace with reverent hands under museum light. In a Boeing conference room, the plant tends its own lineage, one planform begetting another. The B-52 takes the 35-degree truth and builds a cathedral around it. 8 engines in pods, a thin, astonishing wing. And by the time that machine rolls unhurried and certain down an Air Force runway, the question raised by Buseman's pencil has left the laboratory for good. In civil dress, the language completes itself. The Dash 80's confident barrel roll hangs in the summer air over Lake Washington like an exclamation. The 707's first transatlantic passengers step into a morning that cuts an ocean in half. The DC-8 chases it west. The Tu-104 hums over Siberia with the same slant at its leading edge. And the airport becomes a gallery of kinships, Caravel's tidy sweep, Comet's humbled revision, 727s and 737s, and DC-9s wearing the angle as if it were always the way a wing should meet the air. The record keeps insisting, as good records do, on not forgetting the path von Karman's toward new horizons laid open on a general's desk in 1945, its sober recommendation that sweep and transonic tunnels are no longer curiosities, but requirements. The NACA translation of Buseman in 1951, TM1284, which is less a scientific revelation than a ritual of acknowledgement, English words for a German idea whose proof is by then already flying. The NACA history of Langley, where Jones is given his due and his regret in a single sentence, independent but not first, and the Boeing archive, where Cher's May 1945 letters carry the forward lean of a man writing the way you run with something that matters. The narrator's voice does not need to raise itself to make an ethical point, because the images do it. A Soviet flat car rattling east with a crated test section, a British lorry backing into a tunnel bay with no headlights, a U.S. staff car pulling up to a burnt-edged file cabinet in a ruined institute, and later, much later, an American courtroom where no suit is filed because there is no theft to adjudicate, only a debt of naming that the patents do not pay. When the camera returns to flight, it is to an altitude where the early sanctuary gives way to newer threats. The first tall plumes of an SA-2 in 1959, climbing into a sky the B-47 had made feel safe, doctrine rewriting itself on the fly. The Stratojet bowing out, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well, forcing the level of the fight down into air too thick for its slender wing, leaving the heavy B-52 to shoulder the low-level burden, proof that an innovation's second act is often to make itself obsolete. And still the sweep remains, constant as a compass bearing, while details evolve around it. Supercritical sections fatten the top of the curve near Mach 1. Winglets lean in like quiet correctives at the tips. Composites let the spar bend like a longbow without cracking. Computational flow shows in false color what Buseman could only sketch in chalk. And a yaw damper that once rattled in a rack at Moses Lake now lives as an algorithm in a flight control computer, correcting faster than a human can think, all of it in service to a geometry first lifted from dusty pages in a broken building. The film gives the last words to the people who moved the idea along, not as heroes but as craftsmen. Buseman, eyes amused, telling an interviewer in 1980 that it was an idea in the air. Jones, unbothered by footnotes, calling sweep a simple thing seen late. Cher, dodging praise and talking instead about the moment you know the tunnel and the flight test agree. Wells and Pennell remembering the meeting where risk turned into policy. A British officer from T-Force shrugging at the word plunder and pointing to an order signed and dated. A Soviet engineer at Sochi tapping a Braunschweig report and saying it gave them 3 years. A Moses Lake crew chief who never read any of it and just wanted 6 spare vortex generators, and a Pan Am attendant who learned to smile while the cabin rolled gently under a yaw damper's hidden hand. By now, the ending writes itself in the shape of the air, a wing seen from a terminal window, its leading edge edged back as if politely refusing to meet the wind head-on. The same angle that began as a conjecture, survived as a photograph, became a letter, and grew into the foundation of a century's motion. A reminder that wars end, and archives open, and engineers argue, and the world, without quite noticing, climbs onto an inheritance unearthed in ruins and flies away. And if you widen the frame a little farther, you can see the other branches of that same German tree scratching at history's window, the variable sweep Messerschmitt P1101, left half-finished in a Bavarian cave and hauled west to become the Bell X-5, a test bed that walked its wings from 20 to 60 degrees in flight and taught engineers what the math had hinted and the air confirmed about stability and stall. The Horton brothers' flying wings, dreamlike and impractical in the hurry of war, but prophetic in their chase for low drag. Lippisch with his deltas and wedges, looking past transonic angst into supersonic flows, Buseman would later haunt with new papers on shock control lines that did not reach squadrons in time, but fed the same metabolism that turned tunnels into doctrine. In Britain, the Royal Aircraft Establishment's draftsmen trade copies with Langley and Ames, their notes bending Hawker and de Havilland toward swept metal. And if the Hunter's 40 degrees and the later VC-10's careful sweep speak with a clipped English accent, they still use the trigonometry written in Rome. In America, a quieter revolution follows behind the angle Whitcomb's area rule in 1952, a Coke bottle squeeze at the fuselage waist that smooths the dragwise near Mach 1, and gives the Sabre Dog, the F-102, the Century series, their narrow middle and their new speed, another American refinement layered onto the geometry that was already carrying the weight. Meanwhile, the Stratojut's Cold War life writes hard sentences into the ledger, and RB-47H, skirting the Barents in July 1960, intercepted and shot down. 2 men taken to Lubyanka for a year and a half, 4 not coming home, the first generation of electronic reconnaissance dying in a sky the B-47 helped make necessary. In 1958, after a mid-air collision off Savannah, a damaged B-47 jettisons a Mark 15 into the dark water near Tybee Island and limps back to land, a missing bomb that becomes a rumor mothers use to hush children, and an artifact searchers comb for with Geiger counters decades later, one more shadow in a story that otherwise glitters with aluminum and promise. Inside the airplanes, the details that made speed livable multiply. The 3 men of a Stratojet crew strapped into ejection seats, pilot and co-pilot punching up, navigator dropping down around the bomb bay, a compromise only an engineer could love, spoilers rising from a thin wing to roll the big airplane without overworking its ailerons, flight controls not simply boosted, but mediated through servos that whisper corrections a human cannot feel in time, a yaw damper once tuned with a screwdriver and instinct, now living as code that stirs a rudder just enough to turn Dutch roll into a ripple no coffee cup can detect. If you want to keep faith with the truth, you keep the names exact and the dates where they belong. ME-262 with its modest 18-degree sweep, Arado 234 with a straight wing, the F-86 and MiG-15 first flights almost on the same winter's day in 1947, XB-47 bare metal at Moses Lake in December that same year, with a dorsal spine still unborn, B-47E fillets grown in by 1955, Pan Am's order for 2707 signed in 1955, for an unimaginable $269 million, the Tu-104 carrying passengers in 1956 with swept wings and potted engines of its own, because accuracy is respect, and respect is the only way to tell a story that crosses borders without stealing them. And through all of it, the archives keep their stubborn calm, the Boeing folders whose cardboard smells faintly of machine oil, and whose tabbed dividers still hide sharers' neat lists from May 8 to 10, 1945, the NACA memo where R.T. Jones solved in pencil what he later learned had been solved in print a decade before, the UK War Office files with T-Force enumerations of Shriland Cine film and wing planform pressure distributions crated under an April rain, the internal Soviet history released 40 years late that admits, with the bare pride of engineers, that the Braunschweig trove gave us 3 years, and the modest spine of von Karman's Toward New Horizons, December 1945, which looks like any government report, but in truth lays out the air age to come as calmly as a weather forecast. You can watch the sweep write itself across passenger life as the 60s turn into the 70s. The 727 and 737 and DC-9 with their angles set, the 747 throwing a Boeing cathedral into the air with a wing that still leans back against the wind, the DC-10 and L-1011 carrying the same geometry in different spins, and then the Airbus school, the A300 and A310, learning the grammar and speaking it with a new accent, until by the time composites and supercritical sections arrive, the conversation has shifted from weather to sweep to how best to feed and calm the shock at the knee of Mach 0.85. Beneath the airfoil, the ethics do not quiet, but they clarify. It is not theft because Busseman published and because occupation law made seizure a policy stamped and signed, and because R.T. Jones could, and did, derived the same answer in Virginia without a photograph from Godington. It is not pure invention because those photographs mattered, because they shaved months off a schedule that in 1945 could not spare them, because human lives are measured in months in wartime, because the bomber that redefined doctrine grew from proof and not faith. It is in the end a relay, one carried in daylight, and the complaint is not that the baton was passed, but that some of the hands were written out of the program when the medals were pinned. By the late 50s and early 60s, the Stratojet is already slipping toward the role of teacher emeritus, its thin, flexible wing never meant for the black-green chop of low-level penetration that a new missile age demands, its legacy secured as it takes its last bows, while the B-52, massive, calm, 8-podded engines humming, remains the improbable heir that will see out the Cold War and keep flying into your century. Proof that the planform found in ruins was not an elegant fluke, but a foundation. The passenger world keeps its end of the bargain too, carrying the geometry into the sweep of the globe's daily life until the number 4 billion passengers becomes not an abstraction, but a tide. And if you stand under a modern wing, the quiet carbon of a 787, the raked tip of a 77X, the blended sweep of an A350, you can see the Rome sketch still, the angle itself unchanged underneath the layers of improvement, the same simple dodge to the airflow that Scherer recognized as he brushed dust from a book. The narrator returns, one last time, to that first room, not to bask in its romance, but to remind you what it cost and what it gave. Broken panes, soot on the papers, the heat of burned reports at the edges where someone tried to erase a future and failed, a young American reading fast because a door is about to lock, writing faster because an airplane in Seattle is about to harden around a mistake, a courier running because an ocean is a very long way at 1945 speeds, and then tunnels, and arguments, and fuel, and test flights that don't all end on the runway, and finally a steady whine at altitude, and a cabin incandescent with the ordinary mercies of flight, light, warmth, time kept and given back. And in that hum, you can hear, if you attend, the clear note of a geometry returned to the world, rescued from rebel without needing to be stolen, claimed not by one flag, but by the global habit of building on what works, and by the prayer every engineer knows that the math holds, that the air behaves, and that the rest will follow.